talk about that first part. Like, are there is that particularity the idea that, like, look, you've got to both balance the idea that there's that labor unions have been weakened and that they have a responsibility to try and get the best they can for their members, and that may require that transactional behavior, and that it sort of it limits the flexibility, it seems to me, that unions have.
So you're talking about the particularities of the U.S. situation? Is that what that's what you're referring to? Yeah. So I mean, the U.S. situation is particular in the sense that it's probably one of the more dire situations. I mean, union density, as your listeners know, is under 7%, and probably under 6% in the private sector, and it's around 10% in overall. So there's just a bigger crisis in the U.S. relative to the rest of the world, but there's part of this overall pattern of decline. I think where the U.S. The U.S. also has this problem, like I was mentioning earlier, of just having a very fragmented labor movement that is not really speaking with one voice, even when faced with these kind of primordial challenges to its very legitimacy. And it's particularly hobbled by by this sort of dependent relationship on the Democratic Party for achieving any. So basically, where the only way to make any sort of gains involves sort of seeking favors from sympathetic politicians, getting the right ones elected, right? And that even goes back, that goes back, like with the fight against Scott Walker in Wisconsin in 2011 was a classic example where they have a mass mobilization and then basically channel that into trying to get a Democrat elected who doesn't even say he's going to repeal the legislation that they're protesting about.
Right.
That sort of, and that's been reproducing itself. That's been, we've been seeing that over and over again. I think that there are some rumblings, of something different, particularly, now that, Bernie Sanders has sort of like become this much more prominent public figure in the political sphere, that's sort of changing some of the discussion, but that's still this sort of long-standing problem in the American, that's particular to the American case.
Well, let's talk about that dilemma of being perceived as a special interest group within the Democratic Party, I guess, or the Democratic coalition.
So that's basically, that comes out of my research comparing the U.S. and Canada, basically, which as your listeners might know, has union density that's about 3 times higher than it is in the United States, despite having a lot of similar, social and economic, a lot of social economic similarities. And
let me ask you, just in terms of that comparison, how does Canada, does Canada have an equivalent to like a Taft-Hartley? Is there the same structural limitations or statutory limitations on Canadian unions, or are they more favorable?
Well, currently labor law in Canada is more favorable. So a great contrast is, so while the U.S. Supreme Court is debating Janus v. AFSCME and the Friedrich decision, which is about sort of using the First Amendment and this sort of perverse reading of free speech rights to eviscerate unions. In recent years, the Canadian Supreme Court has issued these decisions that declares unionization and the right to strike as part of Canadians' constitutional rights, right? So so that's sort of a nice sort of counterposition. The thing that I need to emphasize, though, is that this is, again, we need to look at the broader context, and that these laws and these interpretations of laws reflect rather than cause the weakness or strength, right? So a lot of the laws in Canada that improve, so Canadian labor law used to be worse than the U.S. and got better. And the improvements happened after massive mobilizations in Canada in the 1960s that surpassed what we saw in the U.S. Whereas in the U.S., you had sort of these upsurges in the 60s and 70s that didn't reach that same level, but they were kind of dismissed as, there was a lot of writing at the time about the blue collar blues. So it sort of dismisses sort of like individual worker alienation, not the sort of crisis of industrial relations like it was in Canada. So that's sort of, so I think it's important for your listeners to understand that focusing on the laws really misses the story, because it's really about the sort of level of mobilization and legitimacy for labor that is sort of driving the push to improve the laws, or at least safeguard the laws, rather than undermining them. And, and that's the same with the right to work laws now. The reason that, so the passage, this new wave of right to work laws in the U.S., there's been 5 or 6 states now in the past 5 years after a period of dormancy of passing these laws, is sort of the moving in for the kill, right? After a period of weakness. So I think that it's important to make that distinction, that focusing on these laws and we need to change these laws is missing the big story.
It's literally putting the cart before the horse, I guess.
Yes.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos